Detractors of Peter and of the Catholic Church like to think that the confrontation between Peter and Paul proves that Peter did not have any greater authority than Paul. But we've already seen a lot of evidence that this is not the case. Moreover, there is even positive evidence to the contrary. In the very same chapter of Galatians, we see that Paul implicitly but clearly concedes that he was under the authority of Peter and the other apostles, who he also concedes were of repute, presumably by the entire church. Now, Paul does not think his gospel is wrong or incomplete or in vain, but he does allow for the possibility that that is the case, which is why he lays his gospel before them, before Peter and the other apostles. This is an implicit but clear concession to their authority. By saying that even Titus was not compelled to be circumcised, Paul concedes that the apostles had the authority to compel Titus to be circumcised in order to join or remain within the church. By saying they gave him their right hand of fellowship, Paul is admitting that they did in fact add something to him. The apostles added their own fellowship, reputation, and authority to Paul and to Paul's gospel. When interpreting the confrontation between Peter and Paul in Galatians 2, we have to take into account all the contextual evidence, including all these indicators that Paul submitted himself to the authority of Peter, James, and John. Irenaeus is the earliest father to comment further on why Paul went up to Jerusalem, namely, that the Judaizers summoned him to the apostles there, which speaks to some extent to the relative authority of Paul compared to the other apostles, even in the mind of Paul. Irenaeus is also the earliest father to comment on the chronology of events, saying that Paul's laying his gospel before those at Jerusalem in Galatians 2 coincides with the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. Like Tertullian after him, Irenaeus points out that heretics, like the Marcionites, used Scripture to claim that Paul was the superior apostle compared to the others, including Peter. I've heard some Protestants claim basically the same thing, appealing to the Galatians 2 incident and the fact that Paul's writings comprise a much larger portion of the New Testament than Peter's, as if that was somehow the measure of their relative authority, when that's clearly not a good measure at all. Jerome apparently concurs with Irenaeus on others obliging Paul to go to Jerusalem, and on the chronology lining up with the Acts 15 Jerusalem Council, though he is somewhat non-committal, saying that this is what others say. Jerome says that Paul and Barnabas allowed themselves to be sent to the apostles in Jerusalem so that there would be no doubt from that point on with respect to the law. And the fact that Paul met privately with the apostles first shows that Paul knew that he would receive resistance from a significant number of Jewish Christians there. Tertullian tells us that Paul went to Jerusalem to consult and confer with the apostles there because he desired the authority of the apostles, his predecessors, to confirm that his gospel was in accord with theirs. This is likely an interesting and early example of private revelation being subject to the authority of the church and its leaders. We know from Paul's own letter to the Galatians that he was taught the gospel through a revelation from Jesus Christ himself. However, at that point in time, it was merely a private revelation that was known only to Paul and binding upon him, but not known to others or binding upon others. Only after the apostles in council had ratified the gospel of Paul did the gospel of Paul become binding on the entire church and thus become public revelation. Tertullian goes on to repeat and reaffirm that Paul conferred with Peter and the rest of the apostles 14 years after he had first visited Peter. Tertullian then adds that Paul would indeed, of course, have been running and preaching in vain if Paul's gospel fell short of the gospel of the other apostles. Thus, why Paul desired to be approved and supported by the apostles and their authority. Chrysostom tells us that although the apostles had allowed and tolerated the continuance of Jewish observances for a time, the apostles later ratified the opinion of Paul that circumcision was unnecessary. It was necessary for the apostles to do so because Paul's own apostleship and authority was not recognized by all in the church at that time, apparently. Chrysostom goes on to repeat and elaborate how the apostles found no discrepancy in Paul's preaching and thus did not condemn it, but rather confirmed it. Chrysostom sees this as Paul yielding to the apostles and rejects the notion that Paul taught the apostles or that the apostles taught Paul in this instance. Jerome, too, sees Paul as humbling himself before Peter and the apostles, and again, to make sure that he neither was running nor had run his race in vain, and to show his humility. In his letter to Augustine, Jerome says Peter was of so great authority that Paul visited Peter once early on, and then Paul later laid his gospel before Peter, because Paul would not have had the confidence in his own preaching of the gospel if it had not been confirmed by the consent of Peter and those who were with him. What a pointed statement and argument about the greater authority of Peter, and how Paul acknowledged that.